behalf of Harrison Assessments, I would like to welcome you to this session with Dr. Dan Harrison on the Paradox Mastery Guide, Measuring Adaptive Capacity. Thank you very much for being customers and partners of Harrison Assessments around the world. We really, really appreciate it. No doubt you would have watched the Paradox Mastery Guide training video of Dan conducting a debrief prior to this session. The idea is that we're going to have Dan speak and answer the background to how did he come about creating Paradox Mastery Guide, and answer some of the common questions we've had it since we released back in mid-October. After that, we'll be having an informal Q&A session. I'd invite you to type your questions into the chat or just raise your hand on Zoom using the Zoom feature, and we will work through all of your questions. We do encourage some feedback. What's your experience been like with using Paradox Mastery Guide? And we're certainly looking forward to having Dan speak. So thank you again for joining us. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Dan Harrison, founder and CEO of Harrison Assessments.
Okay, well, welcome everyone, and good to see you. Happy you can join us. And today, as Andrew said, we'll be talking a bit about some of the questions that we've had, and I'll share you some of my perspective on the Mastery Guide, and then we'll have a chance for you to ask questions. So feel free. You can ask questions anytime. You can raise your hand during the talk, or you can wait until after. That's also fine. Okay. All right. Well, basically, why we created the Paradox Mastery Guide in the first place? What was the benefit? And I think most of have used the paradox, and you understand the value of the paradox. In my mind, one of the biggest benefits of the paradox is it reveals your strengths. It reveals the degree to which your strong traits are strengths or potentially derailers. And that's a unique feature because in most systems, your strong traits are assumed to be either strong traits are assumed to be either strengths, or they're assumed to be a combination of strengths and weaknesses. And that isn't true. There's strong traits that can have no associated weakness if they're balanced, or they can have an associated weakness if they're not balanced. So I think paradox is a real step forward in thinking in that regard. It also provides some really good information on how to change. So how can you, see a blind spot, for example? So somebody, for example, is frank, and they're high frank and low diplomatic, and so they tend to be blunt, but they're not going to see it that way. They're going to see it that they're truthful people. And so, getting people to change is just not that easy because we do have blind spots. We have defense systems. And so you've got to have some mechanism to help people to see through it. And the paradox is a really, really good mechanism to do that. Because first of all, it acknowledges the strength that they do have. It acknowledges the strong thing and when it can potentially be good. But then it looks at the combination and what the combination can do. And so it's just a twist away that people have. And if they start to look at it from a slightly different angle, they say, oh, I get it. And then, then you can use the reframing as a way of helping people to see the so-called demonized trait in a different way, and to then bring more tools to their toolkit using the low trait as in combination. So when they start to use diplomacy, they start to see that, oh, actually, diplomacy helps me to be more frank because it helps me to get my idea across. So the paradox has a really good sort of combination of things, which makes people it makes transformation much more possible and facilitates insights, through blind spots. So, but having said that, up to now, it has not been job specific. So, previous to that, but it's still a really good, development tool, but it's not job specific. And therefore it's up to the person, or it has been up to the person who's giving feedback to people to work out, well, what's your job and how does that fit? And how might this, paradox impact it? And, it's not so easy. It takes quite a bit of experience, from the person who's doing the coaching or debriefing to do that. And then it's not actually on the report. It's something that they were told, in the process, if they've had a debrief. So in my view, having things be job specific is just really, really important, which is why we went with the, job success analysis, or the behavioral success analysis, because you can see, okay, it's not a matter of just having traits, it's a matter of how they're impacting the job. So this is a step where we've taken something that's already reasonably complex, which is the paradox itself, and added the aspect of how does it impact the job? And and what it does basically is it creates a significant advantages, because not only am I not just knowing my blind spots, I'm knowing how they're impacting my job. I'm seeing how they're impacting the job that I have. And it makes it much more clear what I need to develop. And I think, as you'll see from using this, the paradoxes need to be interpreted quite differently depending upon the person's job, because some jobs require more of some things and less of other things. And so by understanding that, it enables a much more powerful interpretation and a much greater ability to identify what development is needed for the specific job. Okay, and we use a color mapping system, and the color mapping is green, actually two tones of green, and yellow and red, similar to what we have on the on thermometers of the other reports. So the green, of course, means that, okay, you're doing fine. The dark green is really ideal. The light green is good, but you could still master that paradox more. And the yellow means that the paradox, your level of mastery probably isn't sufficient for the job, and development would be nice. And the red means your level of mastery is probably going to be hindering your job, and to even a greater degree. So, and in fact, the color mapping makes it pretty simple, because you can very intuitively sort of see where you are on it in relationship to the job. So take something that's pretty complex and makes it much easier to see and understand. So the color mapping is highly useful because it makes job-specific development easy to understand. So you can see in this example, you can see that analytical is high. This is for a sales director, the job. And analytical is an essential trait. And you can see that the green is located at the top. But intuitive isn't necessarily, highly needed. It could be a plus, it could be a bonus, but it isn't necessarily highly needed for this particular job. So you can see that the bar on the intuitive trait is green, and the bar on the analytical trait is yellow. So if you just looked at this paradox without the mastery guide, well, you would say, well, analytical is higher than the intuitive. And so if I'm going to develop anything, I'll develop the intuitive. But in fact, if you see the color mapping here, you would then say, oh, I see. If I develop the analytical, I would be going into the green. And I would be in a state of mastering this paradox better for this specific job. So it does a much better job of identifying which traits you could develop for that job. And it provides a better context. So it's really important. We've developed this concept of mastery level and paradox mastery level. And mastery level provides a really unique context because it's not saying, well, your score is this, because we're sort of trained into thinking about our scores as if we're getting a grade in school or something like that. And, oh, I got a, 3 out of 10 or 2 out of 10. It's so bad. But in fact, you could have a 2 or a 3 and be in the green, depending upon your other trait and how that fits the specific job. So it's a really different way of thinking about it. And it's a way of looking at much more detail in terms of the impact of the paradox. The mastery level, if you think about it, what we're saying is that, well, you're at a 30% mastery for this paradox, for this job. You say, well, it's not so bad. It means there's room that you could to master it. But the truth is, it's very difficult to master all paradoxes. Everybody isn't in a complete state with paradoxes. The paradoxes are a lifelong challenge. And so mastery concept reflects that as well. The paradoxes, colors, if you see the colors on the screen here, they're driven by the job success formula. So the job success formula, these colors are actually created by the job success formula. So it's created by selecting the job in relationship to this person's paradox when running this report. And you'll get a different set of colors depending upon the job that you selected. And so, for example, in this case, we have a job where analytical is an essential trait and intuitive is not an essential trait. You could say it's a desirable trait or sort of barely a desirable trait. And so therefore, your green strip across the top here is going to be in the high level of analytical. And as analytical goes lower, then it's much more challenging. And you can see even the yellow area begins in the upper right quadrant of this paradox for this job. So that means if you're in the yellow area, you're probably not, you've got some development you could do in terms of analytical for this specific job, right? But we could say in general, we're just looking at the quadrants. It's a very different take that you're having on it. And you can see that the red actually cuts into the upper right quadrant, right? So it's very, very different. And you can also see the green, actually, the dark green even cuts in to the upper left quadrant, and the light green cuts in further to the upper left quadrant. So you can see you're picking up a lot more subtleties here about the mastery of the paradox in relationship to a specific job than you would just by thinking of it in terms of 4 quadrants. Okay, and this actually picks up the traits to avoid that are in the JSF as well. So the color system is impacted by desirable traits, traits to avoid, essential traits, and not having one of the traits in there at all. Okay, and if neither trait is in there, this whole paradox graph will turn blue. Okay.
And we've got the importance in the bottom left as well.
Okay, yeah, let me go back to that. Yeah, and the other thing you can see is that you've got an H in the bottom here. That means it's high importance. An M would be moderate importance, and an L would be low importance, and an NA would be no importance. And so you can see the impact of the paradox, which is the other really important thing to look at. So you can say, oh, my scores on this paradox are low, or I haven't mastered it yet. But if it's of low importance or no importance, well, it doesn't really matter. It's not going to have that big of an impact, right?
Yeah. Mohammed's just asked, oh, sorry, Dan.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, Mohammed is just asking a question around the 12 paradoxes. Is that all for each position? or that's the top 12 areas to look at. So I think it ties into what you're saying around the importance of a particular paradox is going to vary based on the particular job.
Right. Each job is going to have a completely different set of patterns here on the color mapping and different levels of importance related to each paradox related to that job. Okay. So it's a pretty sophisticated artificial intelligence going on in the background here.
It's a funny one, isn't it? Because when you first look at it, you go, oh my God, this is so much more complicated. But the reality is it's applying a framework that becomes quite easy to understand with the color system that previously you've just had to interpret yourself using years and years of experience. And,
right.
It actually makes it a lot more simple.
Yeah, if you know how to drive a car, it helps a lot. You've got green light, yellow light, and red light. Stop and think if it's red. Yellow, be a little cautious. And green, okay, go.
Right.
Okay. All right. So you can see another one. Here's another example, respectful candor. And you can see this one is even different. It's quite different. You can see that the green actually extends into down instead of across, which means diplomatic is basically you're having a stronger impact, and frank is having a lesser impact. And so you can see, if you remember, frank is, is a cafe trait. So you can see if it's, above 5, you're still in the green right here. So it's a cafe trait. And it's only starting to, impinge on this job when it starts to go lower. And you can see here, to be in the green, we're wanting to, lean in the direction of diplomacy. So if the person is a little bit more diplomatic than they are frank, it's going to be good. If their frankness tends to get too much stronger than the diplomacy and they go into bluntness, even if it's a little bit bluntness in the upper right quadrant here, then that's going to potentially impact the job, impact motivation of people, impact employee turnover. Okay.
And if you, as you experiment in the system, you can see that these patterns vary wildly depending on the requirements of the job. And it's your custom JSFs that are actually driving it.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah. And when you customize a JSF, it takes into everything in consideration. So it's not just our standard JSFs that's doing that, it's your custom JSFs as well. And if you change the JSF, it'll change the patterns. Okay. So you can see, typically we would say, people would think, oh, I'm in the upper right as a, sales manager, and that's good. Well, okay, there's some positive elements to that in the upper right. But in this case, the yellow and even the red slightly goes into the upper right quadrant. Okay. And so that's saying, hey, you're in a senior position, your communications are going to have a big impact on people. And if you're too blunt, it's not going to be necessarily a good impact. Okay. So the benefits, first of all, for employees, it clarifies how their paradoxical strengths relate to their job. And it provides a context that we're really looking at paradox in relationship to your job. Okay. So it has much less of a sense of you yourself are being evaluated. It's rather you are being, the job is being evaluated in relationship to you. You could even put it that way, or the other way around. So it identifies development areas to further success. So it does a much better job of looking at the areas to develop because it's looking at it in relationship to the job. So if I didn't have the mastery guide, I would, most likely, most people would assume that, well, if my one trait is imbalanced or I'm lower, I need to develop the imbalanced trait. But that's not necessarily the case for the specific job. Now, you may think about, I may need to develop it personally. So, my life is better or well, and that's another way to look at it. But But as far as the job is concerned, it's a different perspective. Now, it also has advantages for the debriefers and coaches. Well, first of all, the way we've done it, it reduces the memorization that you need because it basically shows it all there. You don't have to, for example, remember all about cafe traits, aggressive imbalance, passive imbalances, and incorporate all that into your process of your debrief. In fact, it does it for you. It reminds you. And even if you're very, very skilled, it's very hard to keep in mind everything that's in JSF when you're giving a debrief.
Just got a question from Meenakshi. Meenakshi, do you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you very much, Andrew, and pleasure indeed to be a part of this platform. Very good afternoon, Dan.
Hello.
It's been years that I've been looking forward to interacting with you, so I jumped at this opportunity.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So my question is pertaining to the previous slide, and I was watching the training video that was uploaded, and it said that when the red also moves to the ideal balance versatility quadrant, that is indicative of an aggressive imbalance. So the previous slide, the previous paradox that we were just discussing a while back, in case you are, in case you can take me back to that particular slide, probably, yes. So we see that the upper left quadrant, which is the blunt quadrant, is the red is also moving to the balanced versatility quadrant.
Correct.
So is that indicative of a potential aggressive imbalance?
Yes, exactly. So so for example, this score would be, I believe this is like a 7, a 7 on diplomatic and a 10 on blunt, you can see up here. So if you're 10 on frank. So a 10 on frank, 7 on diplomatic, yeah, that's pretty strong, and that's going to get you into some trouble, most likely. And you can see the line goes down here. So as the frank goes down, then the diplomatic, becomes, can also be softer to still stay in the yellow.
Sure, and it also works the other way around. So if it's also cutting into the ideal quadrant from the lower side,
yes,
that would be indicative of the passive imbalance, right? So
exactly, you can see right here at the bottom here in the corner, evasive, it cuts up a little bit, right?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Yeah. So even if it goes straight across, it also reflects can reflect a passive imbalance, just because it's going across. But there's a lot of things to consider for each of those points, basically. Yeah,
I'm sure. So just one more question. We see that the upper 2 quadrants, so the previous reports would have all the quadrants almost the same size, right? They were just exactly cut out into the 4 quadrants.
Yes.
But in the new mastery guide, you clearly see that the upper 2 quadrants are larger than the lower 2 quadrants.
Yes.
Actually,
the upper right is the large one, and the lower right and upper left are the same. But yeah. Yeah.
So is there any specific reason for it being this way?
Well, I decided, since our scale on all the paradox traits goes from 2 to 10, that I would prefer to get more real estate inside the paradox to show the colors and the impact of colors, right? So this is, this center point is actually 5-5, as you can see, right? So it's essentially the same thing, but I've just cut out the 0s and 1s, which there wasn't, you can't get that score anyway. So,
right.
And the other thing is, because we added the mastery level concept, in other words, it doesn't have the same impact as, you're a 2, your score is so low. No, it means that you just haven't really mastered that paradox yet. So due to all those factors, I thought it was a better idea to gain more real estate so we can portray the dynamics of things like this up in the upper right. So you got more real estate to do that.
Sure, fair enough. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Meenakshi. Great question.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So, for the debriefers, this is very, very helpful because it gives them a perspective of the job right there on the paper. And also, once they've debriefed, it gives the person that's received the debrief that information right there on the paper as well. So then it's not a matter of them just having to remember, oh, he said that wasn't that as important to my job or whatever. Okay, so it also identifies how the person's paradoxes will impact the job. Okay, so it's all right there, clear on the paper. It gives greater clarity about what development is needed. So if I'm giving a debrief to someone and my goal is to help them become more successful in their job, it's great information for me to know which of those paradoxes are most important and how they're impacting the job, combined with what is their level of mastery for that paradox. So that gives me a lot more tools in my toolbox to work with as I'm giving a debrief. Okay. All right. So people have asked me, now what's the difference between the job success analysis score and the paradox graph? And when should we use which and how? So basically, the paradox, overall paradox mastery score is an accurate representation of the impact of the employee's paradoxes on the job. It focuses only on the paradoxes, not on all the traits related to the job, but only on the paradoxes. But it does a really in-depth job of doing that. So you get a very deep dive into the paradoxes related to the job. It's much more sophisticated than we have in the calculations related to the job success analysis. But the job success analysis includes a broader range of traits. So for example, it has wants to lead, it has things like influencing, it has things like pressure tolerance, and those things you're not going to see on the paradox, but those things can impact. And they typically have the things that are, harder to change, but some of them could be changed as well. So from my view, I would use the paradox graph, emphasize that more when it comes for developing the person, the mastery guide, because it's more appropriate for development. It's easier for people to make shifts and change and have insights, as opposed to giving them, a behavioral success analysis report, which just says, okay, your trait is like this, and this one's low, and like that. So you don't get the same sort of powerful paradoxical dynamic of change that you can get with a paradox graph. Having said that, the behavioral success analysis report is a great backup, even if you're using it for development, because you can see some of the other traits. So you can see both. So you can use both. There's no problem. Which score is right? Well, they're both right. Which score is more accurate? Well, they're both pretty accurate. They're just from a slightly different perspective. That's all. And the correlation between the two scores is on average is about 0.7. And that's except for jobs that have many more factors that are not in the paradox than are, in which case, of course, it's going to go lower. So the correlation coefficient is pretty high. You'll find a pretty strong relationship. You will find some, differences. I've seen some that were as much as 15 points difference, and which makes a great contemplation to look at it and say, well, why is that? And it's like, oh, I see. The JSA did not pick up the subtleties of the paradox as well as the paradox did. And, oh, by the way, also the paradox did not pick up some of the other traits that were in the JSA report. So if you're using it for development, I would lean in the direction of the mastery guide and with the BSA as a support. If you're doing it for recruitment, I would say the opposite. I would lean in the direction of the job success analysis report, but using the Paradox Mastery Guide as a backup, especially for high-level jobs or critical jobs that you're hiring. Okay. People have asked us, well, why do you call your course, debriefing and coaching? And from my perspective, anytime you're dealing with getting somebody's behavior to change, identifying their behavior, exploring their behavior, creating insights, facilitating insights, anytime you're doing that, you're coaching. And you're not just debriefing. You're not just saying, well, your report says this and your report says that. Because even when we give reports, we never say, this is you. This is who you are. We don't present or hold the report like that. What we do say is people who have the formation that's the same as yours generally have this behavior. And how do you relate to that? Do you notice that? Do you identify with those behaviors? And 95% of the time or more, they'll say, yes, I do notice that and I see that. But we never use our reports to sort of pinhole people and say, okay, this report, this is you, and I'm telling you this is your behavior, like that. Okay, we let them identify. It's a very important, I think, aspect of giving a debrief, that element. And so we have a structure. If you've seen the new structure for the debriefing and coaching series that we have, it's up and ready to go. It's got a sample session there as well. And you can see there's a structure. It has a lot of similarities to the previous structure, but it takes it a bit further. And it includes the modifications related to the mastery guide. But one of the key principles of giving a debrief and coaching session, in my view, is that we don't give advice, okay? Because when we give advice, we're trying to sort of dive into the person's psyche and say, okay, now you do this. Whereas if you have an elegant process, which is, I believe, what this is, you lead the person through a series of questions where they will start to have their own insights and they will start to have their own sort of awakening. And then they own it. They begin to own that and they begin to then use that and they begin to have much more motivation to drive it. And most importantly, they feel a sense of independence. Whereas if we start just simply telling them, this is where you are and this is what you should do, is a very different effect. And I've always sort of used this analogy that the human psyche is it's like an onion, and you have to peel the onion. You can't just dive into the middle of the onion because that's going to mess up the whole process, but you have to peel the onion, and it comes off one layer at a time, and it comes off in its own form. You don't know which layer is coming next, but you start digging in and you start, asking questions, and those layers will start to unfold. And if we take too strong of a hand in the process where we're not just facilitating, but we're saying, this is you and this is what you should do, we're kind of trying to dive into that onion and the results are not near as good. The person doesn't have the motivation. They don't feel nearly as empowered, and they don't have the same sense of esteem that they would have otherwise. Because if you think about it, in a way, they're driving the session themselves, but you're guiding it, but they're actually driving, you're guiding the structure, they're driving the content of the session. And that's a very powerful combination. And it's very skillful. But what we've done is we've created this structure around, and by using the mastery guide itself, you're able to follow that structure and to create a very elegant process that walks people through something that's going to generate their own insights. It's going to generate their own awareness and to engage them and pull out the most motivation for change that you can. And that's the objective.
Great point.
Yes?
Yeah, great point.
Okay. All right, so we have the debriefing and coaching process. And if you notice with the introductions to the reports, we have some highlights, new highlights in the introduction to the reports. And these have two benefits. The first benefit is for the person receiving the report, for the employee. It enables them, okay, they can read it, but later they can sort of go back and pick up the key points if they're re-looking at it again. Or if they're really lazy, we want to know they at least got the key points. And they can see the key points. And if you're giving a debrief, when you're giving a debrief, this really helps the debriefers not have to memorize a ton of things and to be able to, memorize some exact wordings and how to say things and how to explain, to give a context when you're explaining it. It helps them. All they have to do is they're showing the report, the highlighted piece, they'll pick it up immediately, and they'll be able to use a really high quality wording, related to explaining the background, the context, and what it is that we do, which is very important to set that context when you're giving a debrief and coaching session, so that, okay, they get a sense of that context, and then they're going to do much, much better in terms of the process. Okay, so it highlights key points, there's minimal memorization, and then it follows a process which facilitates insights. The other thing you've noticed, if you've had a look at the mastery guide, is there's actually 3 overview pages now. And the original overview page is there, subjects and stages of action. And that's very useful, for example, if I want to look at the combinations of paradoxes. I can then look on the left side and I can say, okay, how are they doing on the interpersonal paradoxes? And I can say, oh, that's interesting. They have aggressive imbalances on all the interpersonal paradoxes. That tells me something because those are cumulative. Or they have passive imbalances on all of the interpersonal paradoxes. That also tells me something because those are also cumulative. Or I can say, oh, they have, aggressive imbalances on the achievement paradoxes. Well, that tells me that these guys are drivers, they're goers, right? And that's the opposite, because a slight passive imbalance on the interpersonal paradoxes is not so bad. As it gets stronger, well, that can have negative implications depending on the job. But aggressive imbalances in the interpersonal are generally associated with problems. Whereas if you have some slight aggressive imbalances on the achievement paradoxes, is not really an issue. Okay, so I can then look at see combinations which are very important. For example, some of you have been exposed to the concept of the Bermuda Triangle, or we even call them the performance management paradoxes, and you can see how they relate to each other. But if we order these in a different way, you're going to have a very hard time identifying those kinds of patterns because first of all, you're not used to looking at it that way, and also they're ordered differently every time. When we look at the other 2 ordering processes. So the other ordering process is ordered by paradoxical strengths. And this is very useful when you're giving the debrief to refer to that debrief, because if you remember in the debrief, the first thing we're going to do is look at the person's strengths. We're going to say, what are your strengths? And we're going to then acknowledge those strengths, look at them in relationship to the job. And those are going to be right at the top. So their strong paradoxes are at the top. And you're going to be able to then see, okay, you're going to then emphasize the ones that have an H, which is high importance, and and give more credence to those. So the ones that are in the green area, those are going to be their strengths, and they'll be right at the top, and they'll be bunched together, and you'll see how the strengths can combine with each other even. And the ones at the bottom are going to be the ones that they have the least mastery of. And these are the ones that they're going to struggle with. And you're going to particularly notice if those have high importance or to give priority to the high and medium importance. The low importance is not such a negative impact. And so it immediately gives you a very clear picture of the basic structure of how we go about a debrief, where we look at the strengths and then we look at the paradoxes for development. Okay, And then we also have the ability to order the paradox, the overview, by importance to the job. And that's also useful when you're looking at it, for example, in a hiring situation. You can then see, okay, these are the paradoxes that are most important to the job, and this is how they're doing on those paradoxes. And as they go down to the bottom, then you're going to give lesser credence to them. Of course, you're going to look at it even if they're low importance, but you're going to want to emphasize and give greatest attention to the ones that are of highest importance. Okay. All right. So we have a concept in the system now for roles as well, and the JSFs are mapped. At least most of the JSFs are mapped against roles, everything except for, tradespersons' jobs and things like that are mapped against roles. And the roles are really useful for paradox analytics, and they're very useful for teams. So for example, if you have a team, they're all leaders, you can then use the leadership mastery guide, and that gives you a lot of insight as you're walking through the paradoxes related to the teams. And for succession planning, that's very useful, the roles. You can use them for debriefing. Otherwise, I don't recommend it. I always recommend you use the specific job that the person has for the debriefing when you're giving a session or a coaching session, because you're able to then really pinpoint the relationship with their specific job, because the roles are much more general, of course. Okay. Here's a sample of the paradox analytics. You can see here we have it set to leadership, and I'm analyzing a whole team in relationship to leadership. And you can see their overall mastery level average is 71%. And you can see a good number of them are down here in the green, and there's quite a few in the yellow and some in the red. And it does the same thing for every one of the paradoxes. So you can look at each paradox in relationship to the ones, and you can see the paradoxes that they're struggling with. So it's really useful to look at it on a group level, this is the case. The team reports, they've been adjusted a little bit. You can see it uses the mastery guide. Again, I'm taking a leadership team here. All of these people in the team are leaders. They're in the senior team, and you can see how they're scoring against the leadership role. And you can see the development needed. So you can see, oh, okay, for this team, self-motivation is 7.6. It's not that good. It's average, but they're leaders. And so you're generally going to want to see that higher. So here's a really good example. You can see self-motivation is 7.6, stress management is 5.5. You might conclude, well, actually, they should improve the stress management. But by looking at this, you can say, well, no, as a group, their stress level is not too bad, okay, for a leadership role. However, they're self-motivated, if were developed, would move the team forward. Let's put it that way. Okay. And you can see the one on the right here is for larger teams. So it's a scatter graph, and we call it cultural scatter graph. And you can see we're using the same group, I believe here. No, it's a different group actually. But it enables you to put a whole much larger group. So you could put 100 people or 200 people in here and see how they score against that same paradox. Okay. All right. So I'd like to take any questions that you might have.
All right, thanks very much, Dan, and really interesting. And thank you everyone who submitted their questions via email earlier. Please feel free to type your questions in. I've got one here from Yamini. In overall paradox mastery, what are the various ranges of levels and the definitions attached to it? For example, 88% good but needs development.
Mm-hmm. So anything 90% above falls into the dark green. So you would call that in the ideal area, or we've previously called it the Goldilocks zone. Anything from 75 to 89 would be in the light green area. And that would be, good, but development would still be beneficial. And the yellow incorporates from 60 to 74. Okay. And the red is below 60.
Okay.
And in fact, you can see that it's the same as what we have, for example, on the bar of the behavioral success analysis or job success analysis. You can see the bar. It's the same. It's the same numbering, the same coding of reds, yellows, and greens. Except in this case, we've added the dark green area.
Great, thanks, Dan. I was wondering if you might want to stop sharing your screen, and you might get everyone to collaborate a bit. We're really interested in your experience and how you've used the Paradox Mastery Guide so far. What's come up for you? And so please take advantage of Dan being here to answer your questions. You're probably not going to get this as often as we might like. So if there are specific issues that you want Dan to speak on, strongly advise you to take advantage of it. So we've got Jason. Has the user training in the portal been updated to reflect these changes?
Yes.
Yes, it has.
Yep. Completely updated. The quizzes, everything is updated to reflect all the changes.
Okay, and we've got Meenakshi again here.
Great. Am I audible?
Yes,
you are.
Because my internet is running a bit unstable on and off.
Okay, we can hear you.
Clearly.
Yeah.
Perfect. So Dan, we have been using the paradox technology to identify stress behaviors, and all those red and gray hurricanes on the paradoxical graph have really given some really powerful insights to our clients to really identify their stress-related behaviors. So now with this shift, with this change to now looking at the paradoxes from the mastery perspective, is it having an impact on on the flip behaviors, or we continue with the same spirit that we have till now in helping our clients identifying the out of balance behaviors?
Right.
Because the previous paradoxical graph, I know it may sound a little bit childish to you, but the gray and the red hurricanes would really stand out and would create a sort of an alarm, a positive alarm for people to say, hey, I need to change this, or this needs to shift, because this is creating a lot of stress in my life, in my role, in my whole fulfillment levels. Right. Does that change with these changes in the mastery guide? Do we emphasize on those flip behaviors as much now, or?
Yes and no. Yes and no, because the flip behaviors are still there. So whatever they are, they're still there. The question is, how are they impacting the job? Right? So they may be impacting the job a lot, or they may be impacting the job not at all. Right?
Okay.
So it gives some additional insight of how that flip behavior is likely to be impacting the job, and the importance of it as well.
But isn't it a fact that because if your graph has a flip, if it does have a hurricane, if it does have an out of balance in the out of balance paradoxes, that means it is a concern. It could be a potential concern. So,
I'll give you an example. So you have a customer service position, and you have someone who's very, pretty low and frank, pretty high and diplomatic. Our experience is that they can do pretty well. In other words, they can go to work and they can, basically put on their best behavior unless they're under a lot of stress. So if they have a really low stress score, stress management score, then you can start to worry about the behaviors. So
Sure.
the challenge of the flip behaviors is you have to think of it in terms of the level of stress that the person has, right? So you can have flip behaviors, but if I'm, if I don't have a very low stress management score, then they're not going to kick in very often. You're right. So you always have to look at that dynamic when you're looking at the
that
stress.
dynamic.
Yes. Yeah. And so then you also have to look at it in relationship to the job as well. Right. So, typically, in that example, most people, unless they're really low on, stress management, they're going to be able to get through the day and not flip on customers. They may go home and kick their dog, or they may go home and bite their husband or their wife, but they're probably not going to, flip on the customers. Right. So, so you have to think about those dynamics as well.
So it would be a good idea to, before really creating an alarm on the flip behaviors, to also take a note of the stress management score.
Oh, really important. Yeah, really important.
And then sort of, analyze whether it's significant to talk of that derailing or that potential.
Correct. Right. And it's the aggressive flips are the ones that are the sort of the killers, because people are going along, they're going along in this sort of, nice person state, and all of a sudden somebody else comes to light. It's like their evil twin jumps up and, starts, biting people and attacking people. So, those are the ones that you really have to watch for. The passive and the gray flips, first of all, they're much more rare. It takes a lot more to go into a gray flip, a lot more stress to go into a gray flip. It happens, but they're really depicting sort of an unconscious element that's there in the person. And that can be useful for coaches to work with as well.
Doesn't that make it a bit more dangerous to have? Because that's what, every time that we see some passive flips, we realize, oh my God, the person's really going through a lot, and it's more of it's flight. They are not accepting it, and it's passively playing out in their being and impacting multiple behaviors. Isn't that more dangerous?
That's where your stress score becomes even more important. You've got to be really, really under heavy stresses for that to occur, or into a really difficult situation. So let's take an example. The person is very blunt, right? And they're going to have that gray hurricane down there, right? And so when are they going to flight, right? When are they going to go to the flight mode? Well, probably not very often, because their first instinct is to double down. So when they get into a difficult situation, they're going to double down on their aggressive behavior, right? And so the only time they're going to not double down is when they're really cornered. So let's say their boss has just chewed them out for being blunt. Right? Yeah. So you better shut up. That's all. And so they're going to go into their gray flip, and they're going to say, okay, I'm saying nothing. I'm withdrawing. I better withdraw. I'm withdrawing. I'm getting out of this. Right? So you'll see that kind of behavior. So the gray flips are not, first of all, they're not going to be that apparent anyway. They're much more subtle behavior, because they're a passive behavior to begin with. So they're much more subtle that's going on. Like even you take the gray flip for self-motivated and stress management, right? Well, it just means there's something brewing there. The person, they're really saying, well, God, I wonder when I'm going to retire, or how soon can I retire, or something like that. Or I'm going to go home and vegetate, right? I'm going to come out of this, this intense, activity mode, and I'm just going to go home and vegetate. I don't want to hear from my wife or my kids or anybody else. I'm just going to go vegetate, right? And sit and watch YouTube or something like that, So.
Thanks, Meenakshi.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dan.
I've got an easy one for you, Dan, from Mohammed. How long should the interval be between repeating an assessment?
Well, I would prefer to do them every year myself. You can go 2 years. I think it's great to do it every year. If for no other reason, you can see the engagement, which is really, there's much more pressure on the engagement to make it yearly, because those fulfillment levels and those expectations are very important. The expectations can change. Fulfillment levels definitely change depending upon what's going on. So if you want to be in touch with the engagement aspects of it, once a year would be very, very useful. But if you're tracking growth and if you're going through if you're having, for example, debriefing and coaching and people are working on different things, I mean, once a year is also great for that.
Right. Okay, and just to clarify on that, you can do the engagement 2 to 3 minutes mini questionnaire as frequently as you want.
Just the fulfillment level, yes.
Yeah.
But that doesn't track if the expectations are going to change. So the expectations may change as well. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mohammed. Next is a question on senior positions. JSA is for job selection. However, can the paradox graph also be used for selection by comparing 2 senior leaders for the same job?
Well, certainly if you're looking at senior leaders, I would highly recommend it because you're able to then dig down into detail. So I always recommended that if you're looking at the job success analysis, for senior leaders, you also use the paradox report because that's going to give you more detail and it's going to pick up things that are not as apparent because the JSA and the BSA, they're more linear. So you're just looking at a trait and you can kind of pick up some of the paradox elements by having both traits in there, but you're not going to be able to see all the possible combinations with nearly the depth that you're going to see with the mastery guide, nor are you going to see the relationship between the job so easily, between the two. So yeah, for recruitment, certainly high level recruitment, you want to use both. Those are big decisions you're making, you're making very expensive and important decisions. And certainly I would use both.
From Kabalan, we have good training material for debriefing and coaching. There's a need to improve our ability to help staff to develop proper IDP. Can we request you help with some materials on video on how to prepare good IDP? I'm not exactly sure what IDP is.
I'm not either.
It's individual development plan, Andrew and Dan.
Hi, Kabalan.
Sorry,
I just missed that, Kabalan. Do you want to
say again?
It's called individual development plan.
Okay. Okay. Well, the individual development plan, I mean, from my position, how we're casting that in the training now is we're teaching people to create an action plan. So that's all incorporated into the training of how do you facilitate an action plan. That's an area that we're going to be working on more now and developing different almost a menu of things that people can do to develop for each of the paradoxical traits. But yeah, of course, that's very important to get down to an action plan. Getting into detail, we use the SMART action plan concept, and getting into detail on that is very, very useful. And having follow-up on it is very, very useful.
Thanks, Kabalan. So Areti, when there is low consistency warning more than once, how many times should a candidate retake the test? Tricky one.
Depends upon how excited you are about their eligibility. And depends upon how many candidates that you have and how desperate you are for to get somebody into the job. But I will say the more it goes low, it's not a good sign. If they've multiple times failed the consistency score, and you've each time gone back and said, look, make sure that you set aside any distractions, make sure that you're answering according to your, real preferences. If they fail that consistency score multiple times, it's not really a good sign. If you're really desperate to get somebody on, you can keep trying. Yeah, the more times they fail it, the higher at risk they are. That's for sure.
What do you think? What's the implication of these low consistency scores? What would you say?
Well, it could be that they just simply, I never have a big implication the first time. So I will assume, well, maybe they weren't paying attention, or they got a lot of calls while they're trying to fill out the questionnaire. They didn't set time aside, or they were really distracted. So I don't put a big implication on it the first time. The second time, after I've explained it and they fail the consistency again, then I have to start thinking, well, probably this person is trying to, tell me something that isn't really true on here. And so, either that, or they're very, very distracted. They've got some kind of problem that they're very distracted by, and they can't put their attention on completing the questionnaire, which is not really a good sign if you're thinking about hiring them, that they're not really able to put their attention on something. Okay.
Thank you.
If they're an employee, if that happens when they're an employee, it could be that they just simply don't want to do it, and they're afraid to say that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, with employees.
Yeah.
With Lalitha, besides the stress management, what else should besides the stress management, what else should we be looking at to see how often a manager is likely to flip?
Well, it would be the number of flips and the intensity of the flips. So it's really three things. The primary driver is your stress management score. The secondary is the intensity of the flip. And the third is the number of flips, and specifically the number of flips in the same direction. So for example, if I've got 4 interpersonal, aggressive, intense flips, you're going to get some flips like that. There's other traits that can cause flips significantly. So for example, cause motivated. You get people who are 10 on cause motivated. They've got an idea about how things should be and what's important and then what they want to do. And if you're not in alignment with their causes, that's going to trigger their flips. That's for sure. Or the other thing that can trigger their flips is one's capable leader. They've got ideas about what they want from a leader that's important to them. And that's going to trigger their flips if you're not in alignment with what their expectations are. And that'll tend to trigger their flips more. So if they've got both of those things going, they've got high wants capable leader and high cause motivated, and you find that your causes are not in alignment with their causes, they're going to flip all over the place. They're going to be radically flipping. No matter what their stress score is, they're going to flip.
Great. Thanks, Lalitha.
Yeah.
Now from Andrew, is there value running extra debriefs for teams that you've been working with that have had initial debriefs using the old Paradox report, but only recently? I'm thinking particularly if you are working with managers over a longer period in the same company.
Well, it depends on how recent they are. I mean, if you just did it without the mastery guide, you probably would want to wait till the next cycle to do it with the mastery guide. But that's really your choice and how much you want to put into it. But if it were me, I'd probably wait a little bit and give some more time, let them digest what they've done already. Then the next cycle, you come back to them and see what's happening, since your last cycle. Or if you're still in a cycle with some of them in which, you set an action plan in place and then you want to see, where they are now, sure, you could put in the mastery guide at that point. No problem.
Yeah, if you've used that 6-unit management, 6-unit limit, you can just go ahead and rerun.
Right. There's no additional charge for it if you've used the 6 units.
So regardless, it might be interesting for you, Andrew, just to be able to see, well, what are the most important paradoxes for those particular roles, jobs rather. Okay, great. And has anyone got any feedback or thoughts for Dan on how they've been able to apply the Mastery Guide in your own businesses so far? And I've just got another question, Dan. I guess it was. Can you help us understand the difference between giving advice and coaching? You talked on that a little in your presentation, but
right.
I know that's one for me that someone who's high helpful, I'm always trying to give advice.
Right.
It's a real struggle with will not to.
You know, I think it's a difference in perspective, really, and I mean, I wouldn't say it's always bad to give advice. If you have a lot of expertise in a certain area, you can give advice in that area, and it's nice, it's good, because you have that expertise, and you say, well, hey, I'm a brain surgeon, and this is what we've discovered over years, and this is what I advise you to do. That you can give some very good and very helpful advice. But, keep in mind that, advising people, even in leadership, people are in different positions in leadership, and they're, sometimes it's not going to work what you advise, and it's not empowering of the person at all. I'll give you an example in my history. When I first developed the profile, I was just starting to work with it, and I was just getting people to do the profile and looking at their paradoxes and those things. And I had recently finished my PhD, and I came across this guy in Australia who's very seasoned OD psychologist. And, I was asking his advice about, validation, how to present validation and things like that, and his experience with validation. And he gave me some just really good advice, and, how to think about it, how to look at it. And that advice I followed and sort of presented to my customers, and it's gone very, very well. And because that was his expert, he'd worked with it, expertise, he'd worked with it for many years. But then he turned around and he gave me another piece of advice, and he said, I don't think you should go with this behavioral assessment stuff, he said, I see a lot of action going now in, technical competencies, and, even you combine with behavioral competencies, you should go into that field. And I was getting so much traction with the paradox already, and it was my passion. And so I didn't take him up on that advice. I think, it was probably a good thing I didn't. But because that advice was actually outside of his expertise. He wasn't a marketer. That wasn't his, capability. And he wasn't an entrepreneur. That wasn't his capability either. And so I'm saying advice can be, if it's really targeted and you have that expertise, it's great. It's a great thing. If it's not, it's often an attempt to be helpful that isn't really that helpful. It often disempowers the person. It often, I mean, I can't tell you how many times people have given me advice of how to run the company without even asking any questions. How to run our company, and it's while I understand they're trying to be helpful, it's pretty arrogant to think you know what to do when you're not in the person's shoes, and you're not actually there doing it. And especially, I think it's important to remember as coaches, you're not there. You're not living day to day in that person's shoes. And you're not in that situation, and sort of jumping to advice. I mean, you better be one really switched on clairvoyant person or something before your advice is really worth a lot, frankly. And you're far better off to just follow a process, peel the onion, let people come to their own insights, let them drive their own car, basically, and then let them go through the process, because they may make decisions. And if those things don't work, they'll come back and review it again. But by following a process which is more elegant and more difficult to do as a coach, you're empowering the person. You're allowing them to be empowered. You're allowing them to sort of unpeel their onion, let's say. And, people's behavior doesn't change from advice. If advice really worked to change people's behavior, we'd all be living on planet heaven right now, because it doesn't work. Because the reason it doesn't work is because people have unconscious drivers of their behavior. And it's those unconscious drivers that are impacting them and creating their behaviors. And you can turn around all day long you want, and you can say, well, just don't be so blunt, right? And the person just simply can't do that, right? Because they're invested in being blunt, because they think they're telling the truth, right? And so no matter how you do it with your advice, you're fighting against a tide of behavior that's probably 90% unconscious and 10% conscious. So as a coach, what you want to do is you want to bring things to be conscious. You want to pull things out of the unconscious and follow a process which does that, which gives people these aha moments. And they'll naturally make the changes they need to make as a result of having done that. And they'll stick. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. And there's a comment saying the only hiccup is I had a person that was colorblind. We've got one too.
Yeah, we've got one on our staff, and it works pretty well. You just have to get the idea that the upper right is still the right, probably the general area for ideal. And as the colors go down from there, as the grays or whatever they are go down from there, then you get a sense of those are the not as ideal colors.
Yeah, very common question.
Yeah.
Renaud, is there a book about coaching that you'd recommend, Dan?
I think if you're really interested in coaching, a course would be great. There's lots of courses out on coaching. Honestly, I think the thing you have to really keep in mind is really the understanding about insightful processing, insightful facilitation versus giving advice. And frankly, a lot of people that come out of the coaching training that I've seen, they still give advice. They still fall back into giving advice. It's a pretty bad habit, actually.
It's really hard.
Yeah. And, but there's, you can develop a lot of ways of questioning, and there's a lot of different coaches. I mean, there's ICF, and there's a lot of different coaching processes that people can do. It's something that you really need practice at. It's not, coaching is not something that, okay, you read a book and that's good. It's really something that you have to dive into and, facilitate. When I started, coaching, I actually learned coaching before coaching ever existed. It was sort of outside of my academic area. I learned how to coach, when I was in my 20s. And I learned through a process similar to what I'm talking about, where you're facilitating insights. And I literally did thousands of hours of, coaching and learning the process and, and having the process on me. And it was very helpful. And it's something you have to practice, doing. It's not something that you generally, you read a book and you go on. You can get some nice ideas from a book, but I don't recommend it. If you're really serious about coaching, do something that's going to be very practical, where you're actually applying stuff. And honestly, if you use the Paradox Mastery Guide, you get a lot of coaching experience just from doing that, if you follow the process that we do.
Thanks, Renaud. Gladys has a nice comment. It's refreshing to hear this from the guru himself. Samantha is saying that the new paradoxes have been received by participants with positivity. I had a leadership program and used the old ones at the beginning, and then the team paradox with the new format. When we worked through a simulation, it allowed them to reflect on their behaviours in the sim, and has enticed them to actually look further into their paradoxes now that they have greater depth. So that's excellent. Thanks, Samantha. Minashki, what would be the first shift that we would need to make as debriefers of the traditional paradox to make the most of the mastery guide?
Well, the process is actually very similar to the process that was previously used. Just understanding that the sort of contextual issues are all built into the introductions, so you don't have to memorize anything. So just really being able to see those keywords and trigger off of those keywords is really useful. The major difference between the two is that you're really focusing on the person related to the job. So you're always, talking about the person related to their job. So you're providing a different context. You're also providing a different context where you're talking about mastery level as opposed to your scores on the paradox. Okay, so there's a slightly different, and so you need to hold those two contexts as you're giving the debrief. But other than that, you're just walking them through the process, and you're using the same process. You're explaining what a paradox is, and you're walking through that. And then when you get to the strengths, you're walking through an individual paradox, and you're walking through their strength on it. You're basically following the same process that's been there. There's one major difference is that instead of the previous way, we were looking at imbalanced traits. So once you got to the development areas, you were looking at imbalanced traits. And this new process is actually better because you can actually pick up the balanced deficiency traits as well. And so there's a process of dealing with the balanced deficiency traits that's similar to the process of dealing with an imbalanced trait. But there's a focus that, their most important paradox to develop could be a balanced deficiency. It's not necessarily an imbalanced trait, an imbalanced paradox. It could be a balanced deficiency. So that possibility is more front and center in the new mastery guide. And the biggest difference, I would say, is learning how to deal with the balanced deficiency, which is incorporated into the training that I gave, and into an example as well, I believe, that I did as well. Okay, so and if you study that, it follows a similar path as the imbalance, but with some slight differences.
Yeah, I think we'll all be watching that video a few times. There's a lot of, I guess, linguistic nuance around the way to approach this. And,
yes.
Getting the individual to buy into this concept and discover it themselves. So Lalitha has a question here, Dan. Can we get all 12 paradoxes with a high importance? Is that possible?
For the leadership paradoxes, you'll tend to get much more high importance on the paradoxes. So you'll tend to get more high importance. All 12 will not be high importance, no. Because as soon as everything is high importance, then nothing is high importance. So
so from Edja, according to the new paradox mastery, it is not required for some jobs or roles to have balanced paradox. I mean, the results for both traits on the minimum level of 7 and 7.5. Do I understand it in the right way?
Yes, you do. Exactly. Now, that's not to say that the imbalance of the paradox isn't going to impact your life. It might. It could impact your life. It could impact something at home or whatever. So, for example, at work, you may not be in a leadership position, but how you deal with the coaching mindset paradox, which is enforcing and warmth and empathy, may have a pretty big impact on your family. And so that's always something to consider as well, and when you're looking at coaching. So we're really focusing on the job. If there is one of the roles is called personal development. So if you're looking at it in terms of personal development, you can run that role as well. It gives you an interesting take as well.
Right. Okay. Yeah, thanks, Reno. That's a lovely comment. Right. So we're coming up on time. Is there any other questions that anyone would like to ask while we've got the opportunity? Just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away. No, it looks like we're done for the evening here in Australia.
Okay.
It's morning. Well, thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate your support and customership. Thank you, Dan, for such an interesting hour and a half. Really enjoyed it, as I'm sure everyone else here did. And thank you everyone who sent in their questions and who asked questions in the chat.
Thanks for your great questions. It was really fun talking with you, and great to see you all again.